Picture this. A steel research vessel the length of a football field is found locked in Arctic pack ice, its navigation lights still faintly glowing in the polar night. The engines are quiet, the satellite phone dangles from its cord in the control room, and coffee cups sit half full on the mess hall tables. Frozen in place by the cold. Computers hum, indicator lights blink. The ship is alive, the people are gone. On September 3rd, 2012, that's what a Norwegian Coast Guard crew encountered when they reached the RV Edda, a privately funded research vessel that had been mapping sea ice changes north of Svalbard. For weeks, the ship's daily check-ins had been routine. Short emails, position updates, the occasional joke about the endless daylight and bad coffee. Then, almost overnight, the messages grew strange. The tone shifted from methodical and scientific to tense, clipped, and increasingly paranoid. And then they stopped altogether. At first, the Edda's silence was written off as a technical glitch. Satellite connections drop. Storms interfere, batteries fail in the cold. But as hours turned into days with no response to repeated calls, the shipping company and Norwegian authorities began to worry. The Arctic is not a place where you can simply lose signal for long and expect everyone to be fine. By the time the Coast Guard located the Edda, the ship had drifted nearly 40 nautical miles from her last reported position. From a distance, she looked intact, listing only slightly in the ice, no smoke, no fire, no obvious signs of damage. Close up, the first thing rescuers noticed was the silence. No footsteps on metal stairs, no voices over the wind. The deck was covered in a thin dusting of snow, broken only by a confusing pattern of boot prints leading to the rail and then ending abruptly at the edge. When the boarding team stepped into the control room, they found the wristwatch of the ship's captain, Rasmus Holberg, resting neatly beside the radar console. Next to it lay the ship's logbook, open to an unfinished sentence written in an increasingly shaky hand. It read, "Ice pressure building along the port side. Tor says he can hear." The pen had dug into the paper, leaving a tear at the end of the last word, as if it had been yanked away mid-stroke. Within minutes, the Coast Guard realized that whatever had happened here had happened recently. A pot of stew in the galley was frozen solid, but clearly mid-preparation, with a spoon still standing upright in the mixture. Bunks in the crew quarters were unmade, some with clothes laid out at the foot, as if someone had been about to change. There were no signs of a fight, no blood, no overturned furniture, just absence, sharp, total, and deeply wrong. The Edda had left Tromsø only 3 weeks earlier, with 11 people on board. There was Captain Holberg, a veteran ice pilot with 20 years of polar experience. There were 2 engineers, 2 navigators, a cook, a medic, and a small science team from 3 different countries. On paper, their mission was straightforward: retrieve and service a string of autonomous buoys left in the ice the previous winter, and test a new under-ice mapping drone. On paper, it was also relatively safe. The Arctic is harsh, but predictable in certain ways. Storms can be tracked. Ice charts can be read. Experienced captains know when to push forward and when to back out. That's why when news broke that the Edda had been found with no one on board, no mayday call, no distress flare, no emergency beacon activated, the story spread quickly through the world of polar research. How could an entire expedition vanish from a functioning ship in calm weather? As you'll see, the answer only becomes more unsettling the closer you look, and just a warning before we dive in. While this case doesn't involve graphic violence, it does include isolation, psychological breakdown, and unexplained disappearance that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. To understand what happened to the Edda, investigators started where any modern investigation would: the data. Satellites, emails, and internal logs recorded the final days of the expedition in high detail, at least at first. Together, they trace a slow transition from routine fieldwork to something that looks a lot like fear. The first 2 weeks of the voyage went according to plan. The Edda steamed north along the ice edge under a low grey sky, her hull occasionally shuddering as she nudged aside floating chunks of ice. The crew, a mix of hardened sailors and enthusiastic scientists, settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for CTD casts, sending instruments down through the water column to measure salinity and temperature. Afternoons were for drone tests under the ice. Evenings were for data processing, bad movies, and long conversations in the cramped mess. Around August 27th, the tone shifted. Wind speeds increased and satellite images showed the pack ice tightening. In a voice log later recovered from the ship's server, you can hear Captain Holberg calmly requesting updated ice charts from the Norwegian Ice Service. He mentions that ice pressure is increasing along the port side and that he is considering backing out to open water sooner than planned. Minor course corrections followed. The Edda's track shows the ship weaving slowly between thicker flows, engines rumbling just enough to keep her from being locked in place. In one email, the second mate jokes, "Feels like Tetris with ice blocks out here." It's the last clearly light-hearted message anyone on board would send. On August 29th, the first truly odd entry appears in the logbook. At 1:17, one of the scientists, a glaciologist named Dr. Lena Koskinen, notes unidentified noise under the hull during a routine under-ice drone test. She describes it as a low pulsing tone, almost like someone dragging a bow slowly across a double bass string, loud enough to be heard through the steel hull. The under-ice drone's audio recorder picks up something similar, an intermittent, droning vibration that doesn't match any known mechanical source on the ship. The crew dismisses it at first as shifting ice or a distant iceberg rolling over. But that same night, the noise returns, strong enough to wake two crew members in their bunks. The medic notes in her shift report that several people complain of headaches and difficulty sleeping. She attributes it to stress and suggests more breaks from the constant monitoring. By August 30th, the written logs grow shorter and more fragmented. Ice pressure 810, one entry says. Seas calm. Unusual creaking along frames 1822. Another, later that day, simply, crew reporting feeling watched when on deck at night. No visual contacts. It's the kind of note you almost never see in an official log, too subjective, too unscientific, and yet someone felt the need to write it down. The last known email from the Edda leaves the ship at 02:11 on August 31st. It is only 3 sentences long. Position 82 decuid 17N, 19 teak d 43E. Ice pressure significant but manageable. Strange acoustic interference continues. We'll investigate later. It's signed not by Holberg or the second mate, but by one of the engineers, which is unusual. After that, digital silence. Satellite tracking shows the Edda continuing to drift with the ice, engines idling periodically but never going to full power. The weather in the area is stable, light winds, overcast skies, temperatures hovering around freezing. There are no storms, no recorded rogue waves, no sudden drops in barometric pressure. Whatever happened on board did not come from the sky. Back in Norway, when the Edda missed 3 scheduled check-ins, the company tried direct satellite calls. They went unanswered. The Research Institute emailed personal accounts for the scientists on board. No response. Even families, who sometimes received short messages when the bandwidth allowed, heard nothing. When the Coast Guard was finally dispatched, their job wasn't to rescue a ship in distress. It was to find out why a ship that appeared, from a distance, to be perfectly fine, had stopped speaking to the world. The boarding team that climbed the Edda ice-rimmed ladder on September 3rd came prepared for almost anything. Injured crew, fire damage, mechanical failure, even a breakdown in discipline after too many weeks in isolation. What they didn't expect was emptiness. Their sweep of the ship followed strict procedure. One team moved from bow to stern along the main deck, checking hatches, storage lockers, and equipment. Another moved inside from top to bottom, clearing the bridge, the communications room, the officers' quarters, the mess, and finally the lower deck cabins. According to their incident report, they heard no human voices, no movement consistent with people on board from the moment they stepped off the ice. On the bridge, everything looked frozen in time. The autopilot was disengaged, but the last heading was still displayed. A slow, careful turn westward toward thinner ice. A handwritten note was taped beside the radar, the ink partly smeared. Reduce RPM if noise returns. Do not engage starboard thruster alone. It was unsigned. The crew's personal items were still where you'd expect them to be. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on a table in the lounge. Headphones sat coiled on a bench. A fleece jacket, with Dr. Koskinen's name stitched on the inside, hung on a hook in the lab. On one bunk, a paperback novel was face down, its spine cracked open in the middle of a chapter. Down on the main deck, a more unsettling picture emerged. Multiple sets of boot prints crisscrossed the snow, some overlapping, some leading in small circles, as if people had paced back and forth. A cluster of tracks led from the main hatch out toward the starboard rail, where the snow was scuffed and kicked away. Beyond the rail, on the ice itself, the tracks continued for about 30 meters, and then vanished into undisturbed white. There were no drag marks, no signs of a fall through thin ice, no blood. Just a sharp, inexplicable ending, as if people had walked calmly away from the safety of the ship and then simply stopped existing. Inside the lab, investigators found something else, the under-ice drone, the pride of the expedition, sitting half disassembled on its cradle. Its memory card had been removed and was later found in a small plastic case on the main lab bench. When downloaded and reviewed on shore, it contained several hours of video and acoustic data recorded in the final days before the Edda went silent. The video showed what you might expect from an under-ice camera. Pillars of blue-white ice plunging into blackness, curtains of tiny bubbles rising, flashes of reflected light from the ship above. But toward the end of the last dive, the image grew unstable. The water darkened, not just from depth, but from something like suspended silt or organic matter, even though there was no river runoff in that area. The drone's lights reflected off something moving slowly past the camera. Long, filament-like shapes that didn't match any known jellyfish or algae bloom. Then the audio track shifted. The normal hum of the propellers and the faint creaks of the ice were drowned out by the same low, droning tone the crew had complained about. This time, it rose in volume until it distorted the microphone. The last 30 seconds of the recording were a wash of noise and static before the feed cut off abruptly. When investigators synced the drone data with the ship's internal clock, they realized that the last dive had ended just 43 minutes before the final logbook entry, the one that mentioned Tor hearing something along the port side. There were other oddities. The freezer in the galley had been turned off manually, allowing some of the food to thaw before freezing solid again in the ambient cold. A toolbox in the engine room sat open with several wrenches missing, but no clear sign of what, if anything, had been repaired. The medic AS cabin looked as if she had left in a hurry. Her medical bag was unzipped on the bed. Syringes and antiseptic swabs laid out in a neat row as if she'd been preparing an injection she never got to administer. One detail in particular bothered the Coast Guard officers. Every clock on board the Edda, from the bridge chronometer to the battery-powered alarm clocks in the cabins, had stopped at exactly 03:19. Some had died due to drained batteries. Others, including the main ship's clock wired to the electrical system, appeared to have been switched off intentionally. The ship's black box, the voyage data recorder, should have provided definitive answers. Installed after a refit in 2010, it was designed to capture audio from the bridge, radar data, engine status, and GPS position for at least the last 12 hours of operation. But when technicians opened the casing, they found that its internal hard drive was cracked clean in two, as if subjected to a sudden, concentrated blow. There was no sign of fire or flooding, and the housing itself was intact. Whatever had happened to that drive had happened from the inside. With no bodies, no survivors, and no clear cause of disappearance, the Edda case quickly slid into the grey area between accident investigation and mystery. Families demanded answers. The company, under intense media scrutiny, insisted that the ship had passed every safety inspection. And quietly, in the background, people with long memories began to whisper about an older, almost forgotten Arctic tragedy that had taken place not very far from where the Edda had drifted to a stop. Half a century before the Edda went silent, another ship had vanished in roughly the same sector of the Arctic Ocean. It was called the Hjalmar Bjornsson, a converted fishing trawler turned survey vessel, and in the summer of 1963 it carried a small Norwegian-Icelandic crew on a government-sponsored mission to map uncharted seamounts beneath the ice. The Hjalmar Bjornsson never sent a clear distress call. It departed Longyearbyen with 9 men on board and was last heard from via shortwave on August 4th, reporting heavy ice and radio interference. After that, nothing. Weeks later, when the search was finally called off, the official explanation was simple. The Arctic had claimed another ship. It had likely been crushed by ice or holed below the waterline, leaving no time for a coherent SOS. And yet, in the classified annex of the original report, declassified only decades later, there is a paragraph that reads very differently. It describes a brief, fragmentary radio message intercepted by a distant listening station north of mainland Norway. The signal was weak, full of static, but according to the operator's notes, the voice on the channel repeated one phrase 3 times in Norwegian. Vi går ut, vi må ut nå. We're going out. We have to go out now. The coordinates attached to that transmission, corrected for drift and error, placed the Hjalmar Bjornsson within a few dozen miles of where the Edda would later be found. When the Edda mystery broke, that retired radio operator recognized the pattern and reached out to investigators. He remembered the intercept, he said, because of what came after. For almost an hour following the last clear words, his headphones filled with a low, oscillating tone that made his teeth ache. A sound he couldn't identify then and still couldn't explain now. By 2012, those old stories had faded into obscurity. The Edda, with her modern navigation systems and thick hull, represented a generation that believed it had tamed most of what the Arctic could throw at it. That confidence didn't last long once investigators started comparing notes. The similarities were hard to ignore. 2 relatively small research vessels, both operating in high-latitude pack ice late in the season, both reporting unusual acoustic phenomena shortly before falling silent. Both seemingly lost without a clear mechanical cause. In both cases, the last intelligible messages included references to leaving the ship, people going out into the ice. Officially, the Norwegian Accident Investigation Board treated the cases separately. Different decades, different ships, different owners. But in closed-door meetings, according to later leaks, some investigators raised a more unsettling possibility, that the environment itself might be playing a role in these disappearances in ways they didn't fully understand. Some suggested a phenomenon known as infrasound, sound waves at frequencies too low for human ears to consciously register, but powerful enough to cause anxiety, nausea, and even hallucinations in certain conditions. The Arctic, with its vast, flat expanses and layers of ice and water, is an ideal amplifier for odd acoustic effects. Could low-frequency vibrations from shifting ice, underwater landslides, or distant seismic activity have overwhelmed the crew's senses, pushing them toward irrational decisions? Others pointed to the psychological weight of isolation. The polar night, or in the Edda's case, the endless dim twilight of late summer, can distort time, sleep, and judgment. Add to that the constant strain of working in freezing temperatures and the fear of being trapped by the ice, and the mind can start to slip. But even the most cautious psychiatrists struggled with one basic question. How do you get an entire, mixed crew, sailors, scientists, officers, to walk off a perfectly functional ship at the same time without a struggle? There was no sign that anyone had locked themselves in a cabin or tried to send a last-minute message. Whatever compelled the crew of the Edda to leave, if they did leave voluntarily, seemed to have done so swiftly and completely. The families of the missing, for the most part, wanted none of it. They asked for facts, not folklore. Where were the bodies? Why was the black box destroyed? Why did every clock on board stop at 03:19? And why, in an age of satellites and constant connectivity, could an entire expedition slip between the cracks as if the Arctic itself had decided to keep them? Nearly a decade after the Edda was found adrift and empty, the official record hasn't changed much. The final report lists the cause of the crew's disappearance as undetermined, citing insufficient evidence to support any single explanation. In other words, we don't know what happened, and we may never know. That hasn't stopped people from trying to solve it. The most conservative theory is also the least satisfying. It suggests that some kind of emergency, perhaps a gas leak, a chemical spill, or a perceived hull breach, prompted an immediate evacuation onto the ice. In that scenario, the crew might have become disoriented in low visibility, lost sight of the ship and succumbed to exposure before they could find their way back. The problem is that nothing in the physical evidence supports a catastrophic leak or fire. There were no scorch marks, no damage to tanks or pipes, no signs that survival suits or emergency rations had been systematically taken. Most of the heavy cold weather gear was still hanging in lockers. If anyone decided to step out onto the ice in a hurry, they did it in the clothes they were already wearing. Another theory leans on human conflict. Long voyages in confined spaces can magnify personal tensions. Perhaps a fight broke out, escalating into something far worse, prompting some crew members to flee onto the ice in panic, with others following in a misguided rescue attempt. In this version, the missing tools in the engine room and the broken black box become potential signs of sabotage, someone trying to cover their tracks. But again, there's a gap between theory and fact. There were no obvious signs of violence on board, no blood, no bullet holes, no smashed doors. The medic's partially prepared injection hinted at a medical emergency, but toxicology tests on the frozen stew and drink supplies revealed nothing unusual. If there had been a deliberate attack, it was carried out with an almost impossible level of cleanliness. Then there are the environmental and psychological explanations, which some investigators consider more plausible, if still incomplete. Infrasound, for instance, could theoretically induce feelings of dread, panic, or unease, especially if combined with physical symptoms like nausea and headaches. If the Edda was positioned over a natural resonant cavity in the ice or seafloor, subtle vibrations could have been amplified into something that felt, to the people on board, like a physical presence pressing in on them. The most controversial pieces of evidence in the Edda case didn't come from the ship at all, but from orbit. Months after the initial investigation, when an independent researcher requested archived satellite imagery of the area around the Edda's last known position, they noticed something odd. In a series of thermal images taken over several nights, there appeared to be faint, moving heat signatures on the ice, near where the ship had been drifting. Small, roughly human-sized spots of warmth that appeared and disappeared within a radius of about 1 kilometer. The resolution was too low to be definitive. The spots could have been noise in the data, or seals hauling out on the ice, but in at least one frame taken on the night of September 1st at 03:19, the same time the clocks on board the Edda had all stopped, a loose cluster of 6 or 7 warm spots appeared in a line extending away from what was later confirmed to be the ship's position. Were those the last traces of the crew, walking away into the dark, their suits just barely warm enough to show up against the frozen background? Or was it coincidence, an artifact of the imaging system that happened to line up with an already haunting detail? No one can say for sure. The Arctic does not give up secrets easily. Snow drifts, ice shifts, currents carry bodies under the pack and out to sea. In the years since the Edda's discovery, no remains, no abandoned camp, no discarded equipment have ever been found that can be definitively linked to the missing 11. For the families, the lack of finality has become its own kind of torment. There is no grave to visit, no wreck on the seafloor to lay flowers on, no clear chain of events to replay and make sense of. Just a ship, preserved almost like a museum piece, and a gap where 11 lives should be. Today, the RV Edda sits in a secure berth in northern Norway, her hull periodically inspected but otherwise untouched. Some argue that she should be scrapped, her steel recycled, her name retired. Others want her turned into a memorial or a training tool for future polar crews. For now, she is something in between. A ghost ship under fluorescent lights visited mainly by investigators' engineers, and the occasional journalist who still believes there might be a missing piece of the puzzle hidden somewhere in her wiring or pipework. Every once in a while, according to people who have spent long seasons in the high Arctic, the normal sounds on a steel hull change. A low tone rises beneath the hum of the engines, just at the edge of hearing, hanging in the air like a distant warning. And for those who know the stories of the Hjalmar Bjornsson, of the RV Edda, and of the nameless sailors and hunters who vanished on the ice long before anyone thought to write such things down, that sound is a reminder. In a world mapped by satellites and charted down to the last seamount, there are still places where human presence is thin, fragile, and easily erased. Places where, on a calm night at high latitude, An entire expedition can step out onto the ice and simply never return. Frozen souls, claimed by a landscape that does not care if we understand it.